Hey guys, so I'm super excited to bring a new type of data video, and so this time what involved was I shared a survey on the Mannadium Duelist Facebook group just to gather their insights in terms of the key strengths of this deck, as well as any like hand traps, board breakers, and floodgates that they try to play around the most, as well as any weaknesses of the deck. And so this is a concept that I can carry into any other new meta decks just to get a better insight on how this deck actually works, what kind of end board it provides. And if you're someone like me who doesn't have a lot of time to test out all the new different decks, I think this will be a good summary in terms of understanding what it actually does and how to sort of have a good chance at stopping it. And so again, a big thanks to all of you who responded to this survey. We actually had 30 players respond to this, which I was actually a little surprised and happy about. I didn't expect many people to respond to this just because it is a very specific population base in terms of those who play Mannadium, and on top of that the survey did involve a little bit more writing than usual. And so definitely appreciate your guys' input. If you do want to definitely don't miss out on any future surveys, then you can certainly follow me on Twitter. And of course, before we continue, big thanks to my sponsors as usual. Links and discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh! Singles as well as supplies down below. So let's just get started in terms of understanding the respondents a little bit better in terms of how they rate their ability to be able to pilot this deck. And so for the most part, they think they are pretty strong at piloting the deck. Some average, certainly nowhere in the weak or very weak category or very strong. So I guess we do have some pretty decent pilots and also maybe even modest ones at that. In terms of the difficulty or how they rate the difficulty of playing this deck, they kind of put it around average of about 7.3, from 1 being very easy, 10 being very difficult. So I'm going to be very, very interested to see how this kind of scale works out as I continue and do this survey to all the other different meta decks moving forward. So, range from anywhere between 4 to 10. So I certainly think any combo decks usually are not that easy to pilot. Now, in terms of how they would categorize this deck in terms of tiers, a good chunk, 40%, put it in tier 1, but the majority actually put it at tier 2. And so if you watched any of my tier list by the data videos, this actually as of right now is categorized as tier 2 as well. It is seeing a good amount of play online at least. Now, of course, we haven't actually had any regional level events so far post Dune format. We had the Remote Duel Extravaganza. That's the only event so far, I believe, and at least at the time of recording. And so, I think as the format evolves, we're certainly going to see some Mannadium tops. So I'm certainly excited to see whether it will kind of reach that tier 1 level. So now let's go over some of the key themes in terms of what the players put as some of the key strengths of playing Mannadium. And so one of the first thing was the deck versatility. This was mentioned a lot in terms of how the deck can actually be played. There's of course different end boards you could make. There's kind of like a traditional one, but at the same time there seems to be a lot of different options. Again, as a combo deck, you tend to have a lot more flexibility in those kind of end boards. So I think that's a lot of times people like that, especially kind of like toolbox options in the extra deck where you have a variety of different synchro strategies or whatever other extra deck strategies. People generally really like that because you kind of have an out to a lot of most other situations, which is always nice to have, especially as a meta contender. And I think the big board plus counter trap is a very big one in terms of strengths. Anytime an archetype has a counter trap, I think it becomes very, very strong, right? And one of the things I've been saying recently is that I get it, Mannadium, at least at the moment, it's not a tier 1 deck, but personally, in general, I don't think tier 1 decks should have a counter trap. I think it makes it just unbelievably more difficult. Another key strength that people mention multiple times, actually multiple players, is just in-engine ability to break boards going second through cards such as Vicious Astrolabe. And I think this is also very important. Nowadays, in the current Yu-Gi-Oh! Game, you do have a lot of flex spots in most meta decks. And so I think that is something that players that really like about this deck, just actually not only being able to put that big board, but also at least having some kind of chance to go second. And next, the other key strength is just being able to play through a lot of hand traps that are not Droll or Dimension Shifter. And we're going to get to that very, very shortly in terms of some of the key hand traps against this strategy. Now, in terms of the typical end board that players end on with this strategy, and the key word here is typical, not ideal. Of course, you can have some crazy hands where you can have like 10 plus interruptions, but I'm more so looking at kind of like the most average board, just so that you're aware if you're playing against this deck, what are some of the basic expectations that you need to know when you go through this strategy. And the most common response was the combination of these 4 cards, which is Barone for that Omni Negate. This pattern, which is very interesting and unique card that you're going to see a lot nowadays, it essentially can be a negate or a pop, and also provides that recursion as well in terms of revival effect. Appaloosa, of course, is nothing new. It usually has like at least 3 negates, for example, monster negates, which can be good against certain strategies. And then this counter trap that we had spoken about, just very, very strong, essentially serving as an omni negate as long as they have a synchro monster, which really is not that hard for this deck, but that does kind of relate to some of the deck's weaknesses, which we'll get to shortly. One thing you will notice though with this very with whatever they refer as the typical end board, you do notice that Barone and Appaloosa are both wins, which means it can be susceptible to Super Poly, so that is something to keep in mind. Now, there's of course some other additional different combination of the end board. The key one I want to talk about is that Calamity Lock. Technically, this isn't really like a turn 1 end board because it actually comes on your opponent's turn through something like Crimson Dragon, for example. So this is the card that a lot of people, including myself, were kind of worried about as we entered Dune format. Luckily, looks like most players are not actually ending on this, but if they do, it can end on a straight up just turn skip because you just will not be able to activate anything. Interestingly enough, less than half of the respondents even mentioned Calamity as part of their end board, whether it's kind of like their main strategy or just something that they can end on but they don't. So I think that's good to know. I think maybe it got a little bit overhyped, at least right now, so hopefully people are not really ending on this because it's not going to be fun. There's just other generic synchro strategies that they mentioned as well. Chaos Angel is also another key one, just a new addition to that synchro 10 pool, which is really good, just being able to banish anything and just have some protective effects. Omega is also nothing new, especially for a deck going first. Being able to hand rip is always really nice. You have some other link options such as Abomination, which can provide some additional pops, and there were some one-offs from players that so I'm guessing it's not very common, but someone did mention bring out something like Kaliga, which essentially limits both players to like 1 monster effects, 1 attack, and then Archlord Krisha, which kind of limits special summoning. I have no idea how this even comes out, so certainly you can let me know how that works out, but let me know what you think of what the typical end board is for Mannadium based on these survey results. Okay, so now let's get to kind of what I feel is like the juiciest part of the survey, and it's sort of, the hand traps that the pilots try to respect the most as they play around, or rather as they play this strategy. And one way to look at this is if you're not playing Mannadium, then basically this serves as, what are good hand traps that you can actually side against this strategy. And now if you do play Mannadium, then the results can also help you in terms of understanding how your fellow pilots actually, pilot this strategy in terms of what hand traps they like to play around the most, or at least respect or slash fear the most. So now Droll, of course, was the #1 hand trap that, the Mannadium players fear the most, and it's essentially kind of hard to play around as well. This can just straight up end their turn. That I know from my experience and my very limited experience at that playing against this strategy. And so I'm sure they're playing something like Crossout for the Droll, just as if, how Branded plays or can play Crossout for Ash, just because it's just that detrimental and worthy enough to play something like Crossout just to stop that Droll. Shifter was another big one that was mentioned, although someone did mention in the comments section that while Shifter can be strong, there are times where you can still end on a pretty decent board, so keep that in mind. But of course, most decks cannot actually play Shifter. Bestials was also mentioned. I mean, this I put the Magma as a photo, but really it represents any Bestials. They did mention how Bestial on, like, let's say the Visas or let's say the Scareclaw link could certainly be very impactful as well. Nibiru is something, it was kind of a flip back and forth in terms of comment wise, where they were saying it can definitely play through Nibiru, but you do have to respect it. Definitely you can play heavily into Nibiru potentially. So essentially, like most other kind of combo decks, like if you have Nibiru plus another hand trap, you're probably gonna have a good time. So definitely don't sleep on Nibiru, at least at the moment. Imperm, this actually also represents Imperm slash Veiler, those kind of targeting monster negation. For the most part, it was, I guess, not referred to too much, but they did mention something on Imperm on Realmhard can certainly have an effect. And Lancia was actually also mentioned in terms of being pretty underrated in terms of kind of stopping some of their combo lines. So that's kind of good to know. At the same time, Lancia has not seen that much meta play for quite some time now. Briefly, when Kashir was first tier 1, it kind of saw a bit of play, but I think it quickly kind of faded away. Ash, of course, it's interesting that in general, it's the most played hand trap in almost every deck, and you would know that if you watch some of my top cut breakdowns of the topping deck list. But against this strategy, as mentioned earlier, this deck can play through a lot of hand traps that's not Roller Shifter, as the players mentioned. So I guess, it's safe to see that Ash is not too feared for Mannadium pilots, as well as Ogre and Bell. Now next, let's cover the best board breakers that the pilots try to respect the most as they play Mannadium. And now the text is going to be very small. You're probably not even going to be able to see it, but hopefully you can at least see the images. And so Sphere Mode and Super Poly were definitely by far the most mentioned in terms of what they respect the most. And they actually mentioned it's almost inevitable and actually pretty much very, very difficult to play around. So Sphere Mode, of course, the downside is that most decks cannot really rely on Sphere Mode in terms of being able to use up that normal summon and then keep playing Labyrinth as the key key deck that can even main deck Sphere Mode, so you have to keep that in mind. Super Poly, of course, is going to be potentially a popular side option, especially when it can also hit a lot of other decks, even another new strategy in Infernoble as well. And of course, I keep mentioning Branded, but they are most likely main decking this card always, so you do have to keep in mind. They can also technically play that Draco Exquisite fusion monster as a Super Poly target to get rid of that Baronne, as well as the Synchro Dragon, such as this pattern. At the same time, they're probably not going to play that just because, that was probably only the case if Mannadium actually went for the Calamity line. So those two are key. Lava Golem is kind of in the similar lines of Sphere Mode, of course, but just can get rid of 2 monsters, but also falls in the same trap as kind of that, not many decks can play it, similar to Sphere Mode. Single outs like Kurkar and Kaijus, of course, are still pretty good, but again, at that point, it is, of course, much better if you can play Lava Golem Sphere Mode, but at least Kaijus and Kurkars are special summons, so, most other decks can play it. It's just the downside is it's only going to get rid of 1, and they have a lot of other board presence, especially the fact that, just getting rid of 1 probably doesn't get rid of all of their Synchro monsters on the board, which means that reframing is still live. And speaking of reframing, the key comments that I saw in the survey response is that most board breakers that are not Super Poly, because you just cannot respond to Super Poly, most board breakers are not going to be very good against Mannadium just because of that counter trap being live. You can negate Dark Ruler finally as a combo deck, evenly matched, as well as like Lightning Storm. Forbidden Droplet is a little bit iffy, because if they happen to have a trap to discard, then they would not be able to respond with the reframing, but for the most part, they're probably not playing that many traps in their deck, unless, again, Labyrinth, but they can play Sphere Mode anyways. So just keep those things in mind. That's why you see something like Feather Duster, Rogeki, Dark Hole actually not being voted at all. So if you're siding against this deck, some of the things are to consider that you can take away from this graph. The Book of Moon or Book of Eclipse, this was an interesting one, because this, of course, they do have that counter trap, but if they, let's say for some reason they already use it or they don't, this can actually force the Calamity to miss timing. Calamity, the Crimson Dragon actually has to be Chain Link 1 for that Calamity turn skip to happen, so really keep that in mind. That's going to be important. You might just straight up lose if you don't take that into account, and if your opponent didn't know that either. So pretty interesting things to know. So now let's cover some of the key floodgates that players are trying to respect. And, Summer Limit being number 1 is not, I guess, not too surprising. Any combo deck, you're probably going to struggle against Summer Limit. So that's not really that interesting. I think what's interesting is the fact that, both Rivalry and Gozen are actually brought up as some of the key floodgates against this strategy. And that's something that they actually respect and play around, or at least try to play around, I'm sure. So those things are good things to know for when you're siding. Skill Drain, of course, against most decks is really good, right? I mean, you have something like Labyrinth that's going to play this at 3, as well as Eldritch, I guess, if people are still playing that. Anti-Spell Fragments is also a key one against most other strategies as well. It's interesting with the Floodgate section from the survey responses that they were actually kind of saying, some people feel that Floodgates are very, very strong against Mannadium. At least a couple people thought, it's kind of like 50-50. So certainly up to you in terms of assessing that, but at least these are some starters. For example, something like There Can Be Only One, just not really worth putting in. Zombie World, of course, clearly doesn't matter at all. You have something like D-Barrier, which of course, you call Synchro, which can be good. They did mention that as well. It kind of stops bringing out their most powerful monsters, but at the same time, they did mention that with D-Barrier, they still do have something like Astrolaud, which is a fusion, as well as their link strategy as well. So it's not a complete game ender as it is with certain other strategies that say like Branded and Fusion. And finally, I did ask if the players were comfortable sharing just, what are some of the key weaknesses of this strategy. And of course, Droll and Lockbird was a very, very common answer in this section. As we've already discussed, it's a very devastating hand trap against this strategy, and it's something, if Mannadium becomes more and more popular, then you're always going to see Droll, certainly in the side deck, and if not the main deck. In terms of actual kind of play lines, denying access to Visa Starfrost, so it was one weakness that was mentioned. And it was an advice that my friends gave to me as well. If you're playing against this strategy, there's of course multiple ways to getting into Visas, but certainly one way to try to stop the deck, or at least slow it down. And then also they also mentioned some just the fact that they lack a way to special summon from hand unless there is a monster board. Again, I'm not like an expert in Mannadium. That's the whole reason I did this survey. But if this is true, I sort of understand that feeling from being a Sprite player, for example, where you really need bodies on board to actually get things going and it gets explosive. But when you are kind of relying on that body sticking, it can certainly show a key choke point. And then lastly, some couple of people mentioned potential for brickiness. I think you can argue this for pretty much every deck. All decks can definitely brick it. Like Kashira is a tier 1 deck, that deck can definitely brick. Is it at the same level of brickiness? I wouldn't know, but at the same time, that is something that's mentioned. But I think it's still something that shouldn't take away too much from the deck, because a lot of decks are going to experience this issue. So it's not something that's unique to Mannadium. Anyways, that was it for this video. I was really excited to do this. I think it really helps, the community out, but also it really helps me out for someone with a lack of time to get caught up on the meta. So definitely let me know what you thought of this video. Certainly let me know which deck I should cover next. I have a lot of different possible recommendations in terms, maybe Infernoble, maybe Pearly. So I'm really excited to continue to cover this with every other new meta deck that comes around the corner moving forward. So as usual, a big thanks to all of you for watching. A huge thanks to all my patrons for their support as always. Really appreciated, and well, take care guys.